Okay, so an outline of the talk is divided in 4 parts. So the first part, I will talk generally about anonymous communication systems. So what is the abstract model? What are the adversaries that we consider? What sort of properties do we want to achieve with anonymous channels? That's the first part. Then I will talk about high latency anonymous communication systems. So these are sort of theoretical systems. They are like the earliest proposals in the literature, specifically the Chaumian mix. And I will just explain. So the basics is a very, very simple building block that is the one that we use to achieve anonymous communications. These are rather secure systems, but they are vulnerable to some attacks, and I will explain the 2 main attacks on high latency mixes, which are blending attacks and long-term intersection. In the third part, I will briefly talk about some of the systems that have been fielded, so deployed systems, and these are starting from the mid-90s, early 90s even. Some of them are based on trusted relays or semi-trusted relays, and then the systems evolved into more distributed types of networks, such as the cypherpunk remailers, and the more sort of state-of-the-art systems, such as Mixmaster and Mixminion. And part 4 will be about onion routing, which is a technique to build networks that can carry bidirectional interactive streams. So while high latency systems are meant for message-based applications that can tolerate latency, such as email, low latency systems such as onion routing can carry traffic such as for SSH or for web browsing or for applications that really need interactive, that need interactivity. Okay, so this is roughly the outline. So first of all, the goal of anonymous communication systems is to protect against traffic analysis. Okay, so what is traffic analysis? It's basically exploiting traffic data in a communication to extract information or intelligence. And this is as opposed to interception of cryptanalysis, in which you look at the bits in the sort of the content of the message, and you try to figure out what the clear text was. Here, you don't look at the content. You assume the content is the encryption is perfect. You cannot break it. That's not what you're aiming for. What you're aiming for is all the other data that you can still see, even if the content is encrypted. So what is this traffic data? It's also called metadata. So it includes the identities of the entities that are communicating with each other, the time of the communication, the duration, the length, the volume of the transmissions, the locations, and as I said, no content. Okay. So traffic analysis is actually very powerful, and it is typically performed as a prior step before you do cryptanalysis. So you would use traffic analysis to select your targets, to decide which are the messages that you really want to decrypt, and then you would go into a more intensive effort to using, for example, cryptanalysis to sort of break or decrypt those messages that you think are really the important ones, because you have identified through traffic analysis that they are. So just a couple of quotes on the importance of traffic analysis. So Herman from the Joint Intelligence Committee in the UK, he said, this is an old quote, "Even when messages are not being deciphered, traffic analysis on the target's command, control, communications, and intelligence system and its patterns of behavior provides indications of his intentions and states of mind." So this has been used very extensively in the military world. This is what is called signals intelligence, essentially. And just to give you some examples of what you can infer from traffic analysis, if you see that, for example, there is an increased volume of communication between command and control and some unit, you could infer that that unit is going to take some action, because otherwise, what would be the reason for them to initiate like a more strong communication, more intense communication? Of course, countermeasures have also been used in the military world for very long. So, for example, during World War II, when the Allies, in order to conceal when D-Day was going to happen, what they did is that already a few days earlier, they started increasing communication volume so that with dummy messages, with fake messages that were really empty, so that when the moment that they really needed to step up communications, this would not create an increase that would signal that they were actually going to take action at that moment. This is just one example. A more recent example, a quote from Diffie and Landau in their book Privacy on the Line, talking about the politics of encryption. They go as far as stating that traffic analysis and not cryptanalysis is the backbone of communications intelligence. So how does this relate to anonymous communication systems? Well, these are precisely systems that try to provide you with private channels, where private channels does not just mean secure channels in the sense that the content is protected, but also that they provide you protection with, against traffic analysis. Okay. So, yeah, okay, I can also give you some more examples. So traffic analysis actually functions as a side channel in many cases, and it has been proven very effective in order to break even the content of communication. So there was a very interesting recent paper a couple of years ago in which they used basically traffic data in terms of timings and lengths of packets and the characteristics of a codec in order to decrypt encrypted voice over IP conversations. Okay? So exploiting that the codec was variable, and depending on the length of the phonemes that you were speaking, the packets would have different lengths and they would be closer or farther from each other. They could exploit this fact, also using the redundancy in language in order to extract what you were saying over this encrypted channel. Another very interesting example is about inferring which resources you are downloading over an encrypted HTTPS connection. So also a very interesting paper from 2-3 years ago. What they did was that they took as case studies these applications that are very interactive. So for example, applications in which you might want to get a diagnosis of your medical condition. So you get a page and you say, okay, you know, what is your problem? Is it heart, lungs, whatever? So you start choosing with maybe some multiple choice options, which are your symptoms, and then this starts narrowing down. And the issue here is that each subsequent page depends on the choices that you made in the previous page. So as an adversary, what I can do is sort of exhaustively explore what sort of responses I get for each of the choices in this multiple choice, make a fingerprint of what sort of packet lengths in terms of the response I get from the website. Even if I cannot see the content, just, you know, I get so many bytes and then so many other bytes and so on. And then from that, infer which options you are clicking in the page. They did this for medical websites, and they did this for websites. So websites that help you make your taxes. So there as well, like how many children you have, and you have this type of job, that type of job, salary, whatever. And from that, they could infer the information. So this is just to illustrate how powerful the analysis of this metadata can be, even if you're not getting access to you're not able to break the encryption. Okay, so that was the motivation for anonymous communication systems. So a few words about anonymity. Anonymity is a very general concept, and it applies on many different layers. So very often when people talk about anonymity, they refer to anonymized data, so databases, right? So for example, I don't know, an anonymous survey that you cannot identify respondents, or a medical database in which you have symptoms of people and you sort of remove their names and identifying information in order to be able to use that information for research without, you know, those people being identifiable. So this is sort of a separate problem. In anonymous communication channels, the goal is to really build an infrastructure that can be used by any application. And of course, that means that then when you're running applications and you want this application to be anonymous, particularly towards the other side, towards your recipient, then you will need to take additional precautions. So for example, you might have to remove cookies, or you might have to be careful with what sort of information you provide in forms that you might be filling. Even your writing style can be identifying. There's very interesting research being done in Drexel University. They have this tool called Anonymouth. And there what they do is they try to extract, using machine learning, they try to extract features of writing style. So it's based on stylometry. And use that to identify authors. And they are having very interesting results on how you're able to identify anonymous bloggers, for example, using these techniques. So even if you're using an anonymous channel, when you're running an application on top of it, and when your recipient is untrusted, you will need to have additional mechanisms. Also for payments, like if you're using an anonymous channel, but you are paying with your Visa card, obviously the other party is going to be able to identify you no matter, you know, how strong the anonymous channel is. This is only if the recipient is not trusted. If the recipient is trusted and towards third parties, then this is precisely what you achieve, because basically any observer is not able to figure out, ideally, who's talking to whom. Okay, so how do we think about anonymity? So you're probably familiar with sort of a more classical security model in which we have Alice and we have Bob, and they like to talk to each other. And we might want to have a secure channel between them that provides them with certain security properties, such as confidentiality, meaning that some malicious Eve, who can be active or passive, is not able to read what they say to each other, or is not able to modify or impersonate one of the two people talking. We also might want Alice to not be able to deny later on that she said something to Bob. And we also want the communication to be available, meaning that Eve is not able to disrupt their communication. Now, we cannot really think of anonymity in this kind of figure, right? Because here, Eve just sits that Alice is talking to Bob. So how do we even begin to think about anonymity? So this is not the kind of model we usually have in mind when we talk about anonymity in communications. It's more something like this, okay? So we have a lot of Alices and we have a lot of Bobs, and the Alices talk to the Bobs. And when we think of adversaries, it's not as simple as saying, okay, the adversary can see the communication. We have to be much more specific. And we have to say, okay, which kind of access does the adversary have to the communication line? And it could be that the adversary is only on Alice's side, for example, if it's her ISP, providing her with internet, or the Bob's side, or it could be that it's some intermediate entity in the path between the two of them. So you can think of the NSA and the optic fiber cables being intercepted, so that would be more in the middle. Or it could be an autonomous system, an internet exchange. These are all intermediaries. It could be that if once we have an anonymous system, this is typically a distributed system composed of many sort of routers. So it could be that the adversary has taken over some of these routers. So this is also part of the threat model. It could also be that Bob is the adversary. So sometimes these are sort of the two cases that we can have in anonymous communications, that Alice trusts Bob and she wants Bob to know that she is Alice. So this is one possibility, and they want to defend themselves from third parties. The other possibility is that Alice wants to talk to Bob, but she does not want to reveal her identity towards Bob. So that's more the case if we think about web browsing, for example. You do not necessarily want the website to identify you. Yes, and the strongest, well, so of course the strongest is everything, right? But a very typical strong adversary that is considered in the systems is what is called the global passive adversary, which is sort of the NSA adversary, although it's not really passive, but okay, that's mainly passive. So that is an adversary that can see the full communications in the system. This is very powerful. On the other hand, it makes it easier for us to design and analyze systems. Why? Because when you have complete information, it's easier to somehow perform the analysis and see, okay, what can the adversary learn from his observations. When you have an adversary with partial information, it becomes a lot trickier actually to figure out what can this adversary learn. And a bit the thinking is, okay, if we design systems that are strong against that are robust against the strong adversaries, then we will also gain protection towards adversaries that are weaker than that. Okay. Okay, so once we know we want anonymity, yeah, okay, the green people here, this is to sort of convey the idea of the civil attack, which is that because anonymity, you cannot be anonymous on your own, right? And the next slide talks a little bit more about this. You cannot be, it's not just this binary property that either you're identifiable or you're anonymous. That's not how we think about anonymity. You need a group of people that you can hide in, and then you're anonymous within that group of people. So it could also be that the adversary can create fake users. This is what is called a civil attack. And then, you know, try to, because he controls these users, he can somehow subtract any actions of these users from the total, and you would be getting less protection than you think. Okay, so how do we measure anonymity? As I said, you cannot be anonymous on your own. So let's suppose that Alice sent a message, and these four gentlemen received a message shortly after. Let's suppose that the system is such that the delay is bounded, so we know that it's one of these four people, but we still don't know which one it is. So how do we measure anonymity? How do we reason about it? How do we evaluate a system to see whether it's, providing lots of anonymity or just a little bit? So the idea is that we call these people who are potential receivers or potential subjects of interest. We call them the anonymity set. Okay, so we always think in terms of sets. And we can say, okay, we just take the size of a set, and this is going to be our anonymity metric. So this is what we can call, what is called possibilistic metrics. Anybody who is a possible receiver or a possible sender, it's in the anonymity set, and we just look at the number of people in it. Okay, so this is a simple idea. Now, the thing is that anonymous communication systems are sort of probabilistic systems. So very often when you analyze them, you will be able to derive the probability that each of these people is your target, right? So let's suppose that you have a system such that the probability distribution that you obtain over the possible receivers of the communication in this case, it's not uniform. So here the thickness of the arrow represents the weight of the probability. So in this case, user 4 seems to be the most likely, user 3 the least likely. Okay? So if we only think about the number of people in the anonymity set, then we are not really taking into account this information, which is also useful in terms of seeing who might be the receiver. Right? So let's consider the probability. We can then deal with it in different ways. We can say, okay, we are interested in the worst case. So what we are going to do is see, okay, we don't care how many people are the possible receivers, we just care about the most likely receiver, and we are going to take into account this probability as our anonymity metric. The higher this probability is, the less anonymous the system, the less anonymity the system is providing you with. Okay, so that's another possibility. But we might also want to take into account both how many people there are and how likely, how does this distribution of probabilities over all the subjects look like. So in that case, and these are very popular metrics, are sort of information theoretic metrics that are based on the concept of entropy, which measures somehow how much information is in a probability distribution. The idea here is that the more subjects you have, the more anonymity you will have, and the more evenly distributed the distribution is, the more anonymity you have as well. So if you have somebody who's much more likely than the others, your anonymity will decrease. If you have fewer people, your anonymity will also decrease and increase when they are many and they also look equally likely. Okay? Here again, there are many variants. You can use Shannon entropy, which is like a very average measure over possible runs of the system. You can use a mean entropy, which is giving you a little bit more the worst case, if that's what you're interested in, not so much the average case, because okay, maybe you have very good average anonymity, but 10% of your users are very identifiable, so that can also be a problem. Okay. So is anonymity the only property we're interested in? No, not really. There are others. So one is unlinkability, which is a very generic concept. Actually, anonymity can be seen as a form of unlinkability between two subjects. Unlinkability, sort of broadly speaking, is the impossibility or the difficulty to establish that two communications, that the two items relate to each other. We can think of it as two communications relating to the same user. So maybe we have a system that does not allow me to see that Alice is talking to Bob, but it allows me to see that message 1 and message 2 both came from Alice. Okay? So this can be a problem too. Why? Because when you're able to link together lots of actions from the same user, this will help you de-anonymizing the user, because you might be getting information about that user from sort of these anonymous transactions. And the aggregation sort of gives you additional benefits. So if you remember the America Online, the AOL data set that was released and that one lady was identified, this was possible essentially because all these transactions were linkable to each other. You could see that all these long list of queries belong to the same person, and each of them is giving you a little bit of information about the person. When you put all of it together, then you're able to see, you're able to infer the identity of the person. Okay. So linkability degrades anonymity. When you're designing a system, you should take care of this as well, not only of the anonymity. A general concept is that of pseudonymity. So pseudonymity is somehow the range between full identifiability and anonymity. And pseudonymity is a great concept, right? It spans the full spectrum. So when we have one-time pseudonyms, that every transaction has a different pseudonym, this is the same as being anonymous, right? Because each pseudonym is just discarded after being used. This is as good as having no pseudonym at all. So this is sort of one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is that you have all your transactions being linkable to each other, and this is basically identifiability. Because, as I said, it becomes an identity. Even if you think about it like your social security number, your name, this is really a pseudonym for you, right? But because lots of actions are linked to it, they become your identity. But what is more interesting about pseudonymity is to have sort of partial identities that maybe in some cases you might want to have a set of transactions being linkable to each other while still being unlinkable from somehow another pseudonym or identity that you have in a different context. So why would you want to do this? Because maybe you want to build a reputation on your pseudonym. So imagine you're a person that is subscribed to some website and you like to comment on this website. You might want to have a persistent pseudonym so that people know who you are and they know that you are the guy who really knows about some topic, and they will engage with you knowing that you're the same person they talked to a previous day. If you are fully anonymous, then this cannot be done, 4chan style. So you might want to publish a blog or use a pseudonym to subscribe to a service. So pseudonymity is very useful to help us think of the full spectrum. And then moving to even more sort of stronger properties that we might want to achieve, there is unobservability. Okay, so if we just have anonymity, we're still leaking very critical information. So for example, we're still leaking when you're active in the system, what kind of total volume of communications you're sending or receiving, what type of traffic you're emitting, presence, and so on. So this can be used for attacks, so for example, for target selection. So if I am, even if I have an anonymous system, if I want to select a target of saying, okay, who might be the important people in this network, if I only have a budget to put under surveillance, let's say, 5 people that I really go and start looking more in detail into them, but they are communicating through an anonymous system, how do I infer who are the most important people? Well, maybe those that receive more volume of communication, or maybe those that after they are active, everybody else becomes active, so you can detect sort of activity patterns that might give you valuable information. So if you want to conceal this, then you need to provide unobservability properties. Okay. So this means that the presence is not visible and the participation in communications is hidden. To achieve this, you need to use dummy traffic, meaning that even when you're not communicating, your device is somehow generating traffic that is not distinguishable from your own activity. Okay? And I will talk about dummy traffic a bit later. This is, of course, very important technique as well in obfuscation. This is precisely what you do, that you generate fake traffic in order to hide the real traffic in it. Okay, so that was the first part. Second part is mixes. Okay, so mixes are the basic building block of anonymous communication systems. These are sort of the bread and butter of anonymity systems. So the first design was by David Chaum in '82. So this is already becoming, quite a classic. It's already a classic, actually. And the paper that proposed this idea has a very interesting title: "Security with Identification Transaction Systems to Make Big Brother Obsolete." It's very sweet, actually. So what is a mix? A mix is a proxy for anonymous email. The goal is that if we have an adversary who can observe the inputs and the outputs of this mix, is not able to relate inputs to outputs. So it's not able to connect which input corresponds to which output. So what do you need in order to achieve this? 2 properties, okay? So the first is what we can call bitwise unlinkability, meaning that looking at the bit streams of the messages, you cannot make this connection, okay? So to achieve this, the mix typically performs a decryption of messages. So basically what these systems do, especially if you have more mixes, it will become clear in a second, is that you have sort of nested encryptions, and the mix receives something, strips a layer of encryption, and then sends the output. And if the encryption is secure, then it's not possible to say, okay, this is the plain text that corresponds to the ciphertext that was received before. And then you have to take care of other characteristics such as length. So if you have messages of different length, even if they're encrypted, then it would be trivial to link them based on the length. Okay, so you have to somehow make them uniform such that all messages are the same size. That means that short messages will need to be padded to a certain size, and long messages will need to be chopped into multiple messages and then reassembled somehow at the end destination. So that's one part, but it's not only about bitwise unlinkability and length, it's also about timing. If the mix is just a sort of a first in, first out type of system, then based on order, you would be able to link inputs and outputs. So here, to prevent this, the Chaumian mixes, what they use is a batching strategy, okay? And I will illustrate now how that works with an animation. So, of course, if you only have one mix, then it becomes a sort of a single point of failure. It's a trusted party. This is not what we want, because now the mix has become the big brother somehow. So what we can do is to chain multiple mixes, and we can chain as many as we like, in order to distribute the trust such that it's enough if a subset of them, or even only one of them, is honest, then you would still get the security properties, even if some of the mixes in the chain have been compromised. How do you deal with this? Basically with nested encryptions. Okay? So the sender would send to mix 1 something encrypted with the key of mix 1 that contains, okay, the next destination, which is mix 2, and something encrypted for mix 2. So when mix 1 receives this message, it can see the next hop, so it can perform the routing, but it cannot see the final receiver. Okay? And similarly, mix 2 receives this message, decrypts it, finds the receiver and the message, so it can send the message to the end receiver, but it has not seen the sender. It only knows that it's something that comes from mix 1. Okay? So this is also the principle in onion routing and in Tor, what is called onion encryption. Okay, so how does it work? So the mix has 2 phases. So the first phase is to collect inputs, okay? And Chaumian mixes are also called threshold mixes, meaning that they collect, they have this parameter, which is the threshold. In this case, the threshold is 4 in this example. Means that, okay, initially the mix is empty and messages start arriving, so it collects up to the threshold, which is 4 messages in this case. That's phase 1. Once it has collected all these messages, it strips a layer of encryption from them in order to find their next destination. And then they are mixed, shuffled, and they are sent out. Okay? So if anyone can find the correspondence to the inputs, I invite you to a beer. Okay, so that's the simplest form. Okay? So in this case, you can see that an adversary that has seen inputs and outputs, the only thing that it can tell is, okay, each of these outputs corresponds with probability 25%, so 1/4 to each of the inputs. And I saw, but I cannot tell beyond that which one is which. Okay, is that the only? So this was the initial design. Okay, then other designs came along. One of them is what is called pool mixes. So the idea in pool mixes is that you have not only the threshold parameter, but also a pool parameter. And this means that you are keeping messages in between rounds. So around this cycle of collecting inputs, shuffling, and flushing. So in this example, we have a pool mix with a threshold 4 and pool 2. This is actually, pool mixes have actually been implemented in the wild. I will talk about that a little bit later in Mixmaster. And the idea here is that instead of flashing all of them, you just flash the threshold minus the pool. Okay? So you keep a few of them in your internal memory for the next round. Now, what do you gain for this? Okay? What you gain is anonymity. So now, first of all, in possibilistic terms, now a message that you send has an anonymity set that is any other message that comes after the one that you have sent. Okay, so in possibilistic terms, it's potentially infinity, the anonymity set that you get. Okay. In probabilistic terms, obviously not, because there is a decrease in probability that your message will be sent in the next round. Okay. But we can design, I mean, if we choose the threshold and we can choose the threshold and the pool in such a way that we have the same, that for the same mean latency, we achieve better anonymity in information theoretic terms, okay? And in possibilistic terms, obviously. What do we pay? We have the same mean latency. It looks like, you know, we're good. It's all good. We are not having a cost. Actually, we have a cost, and the cost is variance. So the cost is that now some messages will get to their destination quickly, but some other messages will be delayed a lot. So if you have a system that cannot tolerate delays that are too long, maybe you cannot use something like this. Okay. Not only, so not all mixes are based on the, this idea of batching. There is a different design, what is called stop-and-go mixes, also called continuous mixes, in which each message is delayed independently. Okay, and this is to reduce the dependency of the latency from the traffic volume. Okay, so when I send a message, I will draw a delay from a distribution of delays, and I will say, okay, you have to delay my message for 4 minutes, and then send it out. And everybody does this. Of course, you have to design this delay distribution in a way that, given the traffic volume, you will have a reasonable anonymity set. Okay. But basically, your delay is bounded, so is given by the distribution of delays, and it will not be delayed any further than that. So here, anonymity depends on the volume of traffic. If you have lots of messages with the same delay distribution, then you will have lots of anonymity. And if you have few messages, you will have fewer anonymity. This is in contrast with threshold and pool mixes, in which the anonymity is always the same. It doesn't depend on the volume of traffic. What the volume of traffic has an impact on is on the latency. So when you have low traffic, messages will take longer, but anonymity will stay the same. In continuous mixes, latency will be sort of stable, and anonymity will decrease with the volume of traffic and increase with it as well. Okay, the delays are in the proposal of Kesdogan. The delays are generated from an exponential distribution that is proven optimal for that latency. It was proven optimal in a later paper. And it introduces other needs, such as that you need a timestamping service in order to ensure that the timestamps are truthful, that the delays are that messages really were sent, have not been delayed before getting to the mix, and so on. Otherwise, you have problems such as blending attacks that I will explain now. Okay. So these are actually very robust primitives, high latency mixes, but there are a couple of attacks that you can deploy on them. So one is what is called the blending or n-1 attack. So the idea here is that you first empty the mix from legitimate messages. In a Chaumian mix, this simply means waiting until the mix flushes, and then it's going to be empty. In a pool mix, it's a bit more complicated. You will need to sort of flood it and make it flush and flush and flush until you know that no legitimate message is inside anymore. Okay. Okay, so you first empty the mix from legitimate messages, then you have the target that you want. You have to have been able to delay these targets if the mix was not empty when it was sent. So this requires actually, obviously, an active attack. So you let the target into the mix, and then what you do is that you fill the mix with your own messages that you can recognize at the output, while preventing other legitimate messages from entering. Okay, so then you know, the shuffling and the flushing happens, but the adversary can recognize his own messages and by elimination identify the target message and break, you know, break the property in the sense that it can connect the sender and receiver for that target.
The mix only mixes the messages. There's no encryption.
Yeah. That's yes. It performs a decryption operation. Yes. Otherwise, you would be able to link them trivially.
So how can one recognize his message after it leaves?
Because if I create the message, imagine that there is only one layer of encryption. I create the plain text, and then I encrypt it, and then the mix decrypts it, but I still know the plain text, so I can recognize it at the output. Does that make sense? Yeah? Good.
What do you assume the attacker can do?
So the attacker in this attack, he can delay messages, legitimate messages, and he can generate messages.
He controls the channel both ends. He can read all the input and all the outputs.
Yeah, but I mean, if you can read the inputs, you typically can read the outputs too, right? Because the mix will be connected to the internet through some, you know, ISP or internet connection, and it's effectively the same pipe going in and out. So normally, for passive observation purposes, usually if the adversary can observe the mix, it will be able to observe both inputs and outputs.
What additional information is the attacker gained? Because he can control the inputs.
Yeah.
So what additional information?
So the information that he has gained is that Alice, who was sending the blue message, is talking to Bob, who's receiving the blue message. He didn't know this. He wanted to know who is Alice talking to. Did I respond? Yeah? Okay. More questions? No? Okay, good. Okay. So, one way of countering this attack, I mean, this is a very difficult attack to prevent. One way of countering is using dummy traffic. So dummy traffic, which is also what you need to provide on observability, is essentially fake messages that are automatically generated and they are introduced in the system to confuse the attacker. And of course, they must be undistinguishable from real traffic. If they are distinguishable, then the whole purpose is defeated, right? Who generates these messages? It can be either users or mixes. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. If only mixes generate them, then you still see who is participating in who are the real senders. If the senders are sending fake messages, then you don't even know who is communicating at all at this particular moment. Not only they provide an observability, but they make anonymity analysis a lot harder, because now when as adversary, when I see a message, I don't only have to ask the question, okay, imagine I see an input message and I want to know the receiver. It's not only the question of, okay, who is the receiver of this message? It's all the question I have to ask before that is this a real message? Because if it's not a real message, then there's no point in asking who's the receiver. I only want to know the receiver if it's a real message. So it makes the analysis considerably more complicated. Dummy traffic can be used in different ways too. So one of the interesting proposals is to use it for detecting N-1 attacks. So the idea here is that if you have a network of mixes, mixes will generate dummy messages that travel through other hops and go back to themselves, okay? So if you're generating sort of a heartbeat stream of messages that you're sending through the network, you're expecting a certain rate of messages coming back to you. If at some point this rate stops, because remember, for the N-1 attack, the adversary needs to delay legitimate messages, then you can detect that you might be under attack, because you're not receiving anymore this heartbeat traffic that you should be getting back. Oops. Now, the problem is that it consumes bandwidth and that we don't really know how to generate dummy traffic strategies that are optimal, that for a given bandwidth consumption, they provide us with as much unobservability and as much anonymity as we want, as we can take from the system. Okay, so this is an active attack. There is also a very, and this is a very important attack, it has different names, long-term intersection, long-term disclosure. It has known by different statistical disclosure, different names. And there are many variants. These are just some of the papers that have been published on this topic. So this is a passive attack, okay? So no need to generate messages or delay messages or anything like that. It's just observations of the system. And the issue here is that mixes are very nice and very strong to anonymize one message. Okay, so Alice sent a message to Bob. We get this property. Now N people can be the receivers, and we cannot narrow down beyond that. Now, if we think a bit more long term, you normally have. I mean, everyone has your usual correspondence. So you don't say only you don't only send one message in your life to one person. You usually send, persistently messages to that person. So the assumption here is that Alice has some persistent communication relationships, that there's repeated rounds of communication with her friends. And interestingly here, the larger the population of senders, the better the attack works. So this is a little bit counterintuitive in the sense that imagine that we would have a system with, let's say, 100 users that have one friend each, and the mix threshold is 100, so they all send one message in each round to the mix, and then the mix shuffles and sends it to the recipient. So the observation is essentially the same for the adversary in every round. The same 100 people sending, the same 100 people receiving. Observing one round or 1,000 rounds doesn't buy me anything because I always see the same. Now, if we have a very large population, and let's suppose that they are not very regular in their behavior, so there are 100 people, and I'm one of the users of this system, and let's say I only have one friend, which is Bob. Okay, so I sent a message to Bob now, today, and I'm mixed with 99 other people who have other friends that are not Bob. Okay, and then I send another message tomorrow, again to Bob, and I'm mixed with a different set of 99 people. So intuitively, I mean, let's suppose that everyone has only one friend, just to simplify and show you the idea. So intuitively, we see that Bob will be the only person that appears in both the recipient set of today and the recipient set of tomorrow. So if I make the intersection between these two sets, then one could infer, assuming that this idea that people have only one friend, I could infer that Bob is my correspondent because he's the only one that appears twice. Yes?
You assume always that there's only one mix?
No.
Because if you have more than one, then it's not that easy to infer.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good point. And actually, the analysis of large networks is a very hard problem. And until now, it was, analytically, it's very difficult. And the state-of-the-art analysis techniques to deal with large networks use Bayesian inference, and they use Monte Carlo simulations, and it's actually very complicated, and they are like approximating these probability distributions because it might not be possible to compute the probability distribution of receivers over a large network analytically. So yeah.
You also don't have access to all the mixes, to all the traffic.
Well, the assumption with high latency mixes is the standard adversary is the global passive adversary. So it's always the case that I don't think I've seen works that don't consider that adversary for high latency. For low latency is different. But for high latency, always is the global passive adversary. Because otherwise, it becomes really, how do you even begin to do the analysis, right? If you only have a view on part of the network. Yeah?
Even if you have a couple of mixes, then you observe the inputs to the set of mixes and to the output of the set of mixes, and you can use the same, it's the same as one mix.
Yeah, it's the same as one mix. Then you start, yes, but depending on how they are connected. If you have a cascade, then it's really the same as one mix. A cascade that goes through 1, 2, 3, 4. If you have a network and the routes of messages are different, then you start having delays that are a little bit different because they depend on arrival times to different mixes. They are not all going to flush at the same time. So you basically would have, even with Chaumian mixes, sort of a time window of messages to consider. It will be not as straightforward as saying, okay, it's the end people that receive.
But you can simulate all that complexity in a single mix as well. So you could have multiple mixes implemented in a single mix, right? You could have a delay based on just random time, and then another one which is pool, another one which is another pool of a different you can do all of that in a single mix. You can approximate it, but I'm not sure you can replicate precisely a network as a model. Yeah. You can make an approximation, but you cannot model a network with, say, 10 mixes connected with a free route, meaning that any route through every mix is possible, and maybe you have variable length paths that some messages go through 2 mixes, some messages go through 10. I don't think you can have a model of one mix that somehow gives you the same results as the analysis of the network.
If we continue, could you have a mix which is sort of like an adversarial mix, which doesn't choose in random, but just to confuse the person doing the analysis? So So instead of choosing, you said I choose 100 today and I choose 100 tomorrow, and the intersection is the same one. I don't have to choose the 100 in random. And then the person looking at it would think that I have this friend, which the mix made him my friend just to confuse him.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm understanding what your proposal is.
So you're saying that if I have multiple messages,
yes,
during the intersection, eventually I'll figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
But that's because the mix chooses people in random to send it.
No, it's not the mix who chooses, huh? It's the senders who choose the recipient. So I am sending a message to you. It's not that the mix chooses to send it to you. It's that the mix decrypts and says, who's the recipient? Oh, this person, so he gives you the message. The recipients are chosen by the senders. Does that make sense? Or are you talking about generating dummy traffic, that you generate additional messages?
Yeah, the dummy traffic.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, sure. That's what you can do, right? Like that's the countermeasure that makes these attacks harder. And it has, yeah, there are proposals to use dummy traffic to increase, to introduce noise and make this kind of analysis more difficult. Yeah.
Each sender needs to know the entire key set for all mixes in the
Yes. Yes.
It's a very hard assumption.
In large networks, yes. And actually in Tor, that's a little bit of an issue because it's becoming a bit big. And getting the keys for all the onion routers is considerable traffic. For this type of networks, the deployed systems are actually a lot smaller, so it's a few dozen mixes, so that's not such a big issue. Yeah, the problem is if you start having systems in which, that's a very good question, because if you start having systems in which I do not know all the mixes, I only know a subset, then you open yourself to what is called fingerprinting, it's a type of fingerprinting attack, which means that if the adversary can see which mixes I know, because I downloaded only a subset of the whole key set.
You're reducing the key space, so considering also the mix space.
Exactly, and then the fact that, who might, if you're able to start making links that, somebody who knows these two mixes, because the message is going from here to here, who is that person? And maybe that person, there are not so many of us. And the more you can link in a chain, it becomes combinatorial, essentially. Yeah. Okay. So just to illustrate, is that we combine. So for long-term statistical disclosure attacks, we look at the many rounds of communication. We combine all these observations, and then we see which people are receiving more when Alice is sending in the round compared to rounds in which Alice is not sending. Okay, so you create like two states, when she sends, when she doesn't send, and sort of the differential, it starts, with more observations, starts giving you somehow an idea of the set of recipients. These attacks, I must say, they're also difficult to deal with because you need to somehow make assumptions about user behavior. They're somehow, to a large extent, dependent on user behavior. And there are more modern versions of the attacks that try to do away with these assumptions of user behavior by inferring her user behavior without having prior assumptions. But the earliest attacks, they say, okay, Alice has n friends, and she will not send to anyone who's not part of these n friends. Or she has a specific, pattern of behavior that she sends to her n friends, even if not the same number of messages to all of them. But her profile of sending does not vary over time, which is not, if I look at to whom I sent emails this week and I compare it to last week, probably, the sort of the probability of sending to a given person is changing over time. Okay, so some notes on disclosure attacks. Basically, this is an attack that applies to any type of anonymous channel that, in which there are persistent communications, in which long-term relationships that are happening through the network. And observability might help, so this is the use of dummy traffic, but of course it's expensive, and still you might have difficulties concealing online offline, because even if whenever I'm online, I'm sending dummy messages, obviously I cannot send them if I am not online, so that's also a limitation. Now, the good news, so that's the bad news, that this is hard to prevent. The good news is that these are attacks that take time. They take many observations. Therefore, you might have things playing in your favor, such as modifications in behavior, such as your profile, that is what the adversary is trying to guess, might be a moving target because you're changing your set of recipients. So the people you were sending messages in the first observations, you're no longer communicating with them, and you made some new friends who are now appearing. So this makes it a lot harder to deploy these attacks. And also maybe you don't care if the adversary can guess that, you know, last year you sent a message to this person, because it might be tactical. It might be that you don't want the adversary to know that you're communicating now, but, you know, sometime after, if we are organizing a demonstration, after the demonstration is finished, you know, maybe it's not so important to know that we were planning this, because it will be maybe public information afterwards. In some cases, maybe tactical. Okay, some notes on verifiable mixing. So when David Chaum proposed the mix, there were like sort of two fields of research emerging from this seminal work. The first was what I just explained, mixes for anonymous email, for anonymous communications, and the other is going more into verifiable mixing, which is used in voting applications. Okay, so you can use a mix to implement an e-voting scheme. You have two kinds of requirements in an e-voting scheme. The votes have to be anonymous. Okay, so you cannot link vote to the voter. In this case, you only have one receiver, which is the polling station. So everybody who's sending messages to this mix will send messages that go to the polling station. It's not the receiver that is what you conceal, but it's which specific message was sent by which specific voter. Now, it's not only, that's only one requirement, there's an even more important requirement, which is the election integrity, meaning that all votes are counted, that they are not modified, and so on, so election integrity. So we don't need to be too concerned in voting schemes about the two attacks I mentioned. N-1 attacks should not be possible, because it should not be possible for the adversary to prevent voters from vote and to insert his own votes. If he can do that, then, I don't think we have the problem is much bigger than knowing what the one person that is left voting voted for. Yeah, that's not the problem we should be concerned about. Long-term intersection attacks, also very hard because they need many samples, and elections are happening typically every few months or every few years even. So, and the fluctuations in voter behavior, people who used to vote for one party, then they changed, are also coming into play. So long-term disclosure attacks are not really of application in this case. So that means that mixes are actually have nice properties for this kind of application, but we need to ensure integrity. So in this research, mixes must prove that the outputs that they produce are actually a permutation of the inputs and that have not been tampered with by the mix, or that no inputs have been inserted or no inputs have been deleted. And there is, as I said, a whole body of research that is looking into how to create mix systems that are robust against mixes that are malicious, that they try to not to delete some votes or insert votes. And the idea here is that no entity, there's a security property for the anonymity property for the full system, no entity should learn anything except for the vote tally, so what is the result, who got so many votes. And we also want to provide universal verifiability. So anybody, not only that information should be known, what is the tally, but everyone, or it should be possible for everyone to see that this is indeed the correct tally. Ideally, in voting systems, you also have other properties such as receipt freeness, so that it's not possible for people to sell their votes and prove that they voted in a certain way. So that's a different, yeah.
In your list at the top there, 1 and 2, what about ensuring that each person only votes 0 or 1 time?
Yes, of course, yeah.
So how do you, that sounds like something that might be attackable, because if I'm a voter, and somehow the system has to confirm to me that I voted and then record that I can't vote again.
Yeah, that's absolutely, that has to be part of the system, that you need to get some sort of token that you can only use once and that cannot be reused, and you get only one of them, and this is sort of in the registration phase as a voter for the election, absolutely. Yeah, this is the people who do verifiable mixing. I mean, they have the voting scenario in mind. So I believe this is also part of their design. Yeah.
My question isn't whether it can be attended to.
Yeah.
Whether the service can be provided. I'm sure it can.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds. What I'm asking is, how can you provide that service, ensuring that I only vote once and confirming to me that I voted in a non-attack, in a way that's resistant to the kind of attacks you were talking about earlier. It sounds like a communication which has a pattern and is not anonymous and so on, because your system is sending me a message saying, here you're eligible to vote, you have voted, you haven't, you voted already, you can't vote again, that whole...
Yeah, that's a good... So, yeah, the system would not conceal whether you have voted or not. I don't think that would be the case, because for that you would need to have some sort of dummy traffic, which you don't want to have in this case. So it would not be secret whether, it would be known whether you are an eligible voter and you have received a ballot, and it would be known whether you have actually used your ballot to vote and when you voted. I think that that would definitely be accessible to the adversary, yeah. That would not be concealed. But isn't that sort of known as well in paper elections? Whether you voted or not, is that secret information or is that public information? I mean, who's eligible to vote is public information, if I understand correctly, right?
It can be, but this is the whole, of course, what we're talking about this week is the difference between paper systems and online systems.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's known to my local polling station whether or not I have voted, because the security guard probably and the polling person saw me. But the minute those records are not only computerized, but traffic is all over the internet, then that part of privacy seems...
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's true that you would be able to see who's a regular voter, who's not a regular voter. This can be very useful for political campaigns to know, and actually in the US, which is, they use quite extensively sort of data science to allocate their campaign efforts.
Find out if there is party-specific voting, that is, I'm a registered Republican or Democrat or something like that, then we can know that we can not only know that the Democratic voting rate in this election at this hour is lower, and so we should do something. We can even know, perhaps, who has, with an attack, we can know these people haven't
voted yet.
Hold them up, bother them. Absolutely.
But I believe, as I said, I believe this is actually done extensively, and that they actually use this information of likely voters in order to allocate efforts to say, okay, if we need to send people to people's houses and drag them to the polls, who are the key people that are the flimsy ones that, with a little bit of pressure might go, but, so yeah, absolutely. On the other hand, I believe registered voters is something you want to be public, because I want to know that there is no fraud in the making of in sort of the distribution of the voting powers, right? You don't want, for example, if you're in a village, voting rights be given to people who are not in the village, so you need to know that.
I was thinking more specifically of
the timing of voting on...
The attack on... I think the thing that's supposed to be private is not only my vote, but whether or not...
You voted.
Whether, in countries where it's legal not to exercise my right to vote, whether or not I voted and whether or not I voted in this particular election. And that communication channel seems
exposed. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's right. Yeah.
I just want to mention that in Israel, in the ballot box, representatives of the parties send back the information to the parties. So it's not only that the Central Election Committee knows that information, also the parties get this information. And if you happen to be a representative at the ballot box, you can go behind the curtain, see how many votes are missing, and then identify how many people in the last hour voted for which parties, and then you do exactly disclosure attacks to find out who voted what.
Bad news.
Okay. So that was all for mixes. So what about deployed systems? Because, I mean, everything I've talked about is just academic papers, right? So a few systems have been deployed. So the first commercial available, well, I'm not sure if it was paid system, but available to users was in '93, so this is pretty old. It was by a Finnish man called Helsingius, and it was called Anonymity. This was a very, very simple system. It was just a proxy. It didn't even use encryption of any kind. And the only thing it did was to substitute email headers, right? So you would be, if you're Bob, you send, it kept a table of correspondences of a sort of real email address and names within the Anonymity system. If you're Bob, then, and you want to send an anonymous email to Alice, because I believe, anonymous email to Alice, then you send it to Anonymity, where you have an account. And the Anonymity server will strip from Bob, substitute it by XYZ at Anonymity, and send it back, and forward the message to Alice. It supported anonymous replies, so if Alice wants to respond to this anonymous email, it will just send an email response to XYZ, and the server will look into the table, see this is for Bob, and forward the message to Bob. Okay, so this is, trivial, right? Why is this an interesting case? It's because it's trivial, even based on content. There was no encryption. It's trivial. So what is interesting about this case is that it was brought down what is called a legal attack, right? And this gave some lessons to the sort of anonymity, people interested in anonymity. So what happened here is that somebody used the service to publish documents of the Church of Scientology. Okay, so the Church of Scientology, they are very keen on keeping their documents secret, and they were very angry that somebody had published to the world their internal documents. So they went to the court and they required the operator, Helsingius, to hand over the correspondence between the anonymous name of the person that had leaked these documents and the real email address. He didn't want to do it, so there was a lengthy and very difficult court battle. He actually stopped the service because he said he could no longer guarantee the anonymity of its users. In the end, I believe he had to provide the correspondence, and it turned out to be some other proxy, so the Scientology Church could not find who the actual sender was. But there was a very important lesson, which is do not keep tables of correspondences, okay? And the deeper lesson here is that in anonymity systems, you don't only need to think about protecting the users, but you might want to think about protecting the service operators as well. So in a way, it cuts both ways, this idea of not having trusted points that are single points of failure, not only because these people or entities might become malicious and the anonymized users or deploy all kinds of attacks, but they might become targets of attack as well if they hold information that is valuable and can be used to break the properties of the system. Okay, so that's simple and seems very trivial, but it's a rather important lesson when designing these kinds of systems. So a similar idea, and this is not email, this is low latency, but I'm including it here because it's so similar to the concept of Anonymity that it sort of goes better here than when talking about Tor anonymous routing. So there's the other designs such as Anonymizer and SafeWeb that also came up in the mid-90s. These are for web browsing. So these are web proxies. What they do is that they strip information, identifying information from the HTTP headers, and they forward it to the website of destination. They use SSL in the connection between the user and their service itself, so that an adversary is not able to see here like what the content is, and therefore is not able to see what the destination website is. They perform other tasks such as filtering active content, because there are attacks that exploit active content that can be used to de-anonymize the user, even if it's using this SafeWeb server. And the advantage here is that you don't have this problem of keeping the tables, because you don't need any long-term logs. Basically, the initiator, the sender, is initiating the communication, establishing a channel, bidirectional. The moment the website has been completely downloaded, communication is sort of stopped, and then you can forget all the session keys, all the information. You get forward security. You don't need to keep any correspondences of who accessed which website. Now here there is no padding or no mixing, so any adversary who can observe the server can trivially link inputs and outputs based on the shape of the traffic. So even just volume of traffic and timing. So I see a connection coming in, and then a few milliseconds later, the same shape of traffic coming out and going somewhere else, and it's sort of trivial to say, okay, so this input is this output. And then, of course, it's important that to remark that in systems that use only one trusted proxy, you're essentially in the hands of the operators, and it is important to keep in mind that if they become malicious, then you have no anonymity. And actually, there are some fishy stories with Anonymizer and SafeWeb. We conducted a study last year looking into device browser fingerprinting. So this is it's not an attack, it's a practice by certain websites that can be used for tracking people online. So typically for tracking, what you would use is cookies. Cookies is a straightforward way of tracking people. You put a cookie, and then when they come back, you can identify them, and this is some sort of unique number. So it's very easy to link together different sessions of one person, and to even, if you're sharing cookies between sites or synchronizing cookies between sites, you're able to track them across different websites, okay? So that's very powerful. The thing is that cookies, I mean, we have means to block. You can delete cookies, you can block them. I mean, there are things in the browser that users can do, in the configuration-wise, to prevent or make difficult this kind of tracking. So website and device fingerprinting is a sort of a stateless tracking that does not require storing any information in your browser. So the way it is done, is that what you do is that you collect characteristics of the browser and the device by using JavaScript or Flash scripts, for example, meaning that you start asking the device, okay, which operating system do you have, which version of the browser, which fonts do you support, and then if you ask enough characteristics, the space is so big that you start narrowing down, and there is only one computer that has all of these characteristics, so it functions as a fingerprint. Okay, so that was the sort of introduction to this. In our group, we did this study of doing a survey of the top, for one of the cases was the top 1 million Alexa sites, and seeing who is deploying these kind of techniques to track users. So it was very interesting to see that Anonymizer, so the homepage of Anonymizer actually included fingerprinting scripts, which are meant for identification of users, right? And after the paper was published, they sort of removed the scripts from the website. But it was interesting to see.
Did they comment? Did they say anything?
No, it just removed. I'm not aware of them saying anything. And there have been also sort of news releases saying that Anonymizer has been acquired by companies that are tied to sort of the surveillance apparatus. So yeah, I would be careful to use Anonymizer, to be honest. In any case, Anonymizer is a sort of bus by default, because you have to pay with a credit card for the service, right? So even if they are not keeping any table of correspondences, I'm sure they're keeping like financial records, so it's very easy to see like who their users are, even like with hard identification credit card numbers. Okay, so that's so much for single proxy systems. So also based on the experience of Helsingius and AnonPenetFi, Hughes and Finney in '96, so this is right after AnonPenetFi was brought down, they came up with the sort of the cypherpunk remailers that tried to address some of the problems that AnonPenetFi run into. So first of all, no tables, okay, no tables. The routing information must be in the message itself. It should not be kept as a permanent log in the server. Okay, so what you do is that you put the routing information in sort of the envelope, and then you encrypt that, and then that's what you send to the remailer, instead of the remailer keeping a correspondence of these things.
Then you are subject to the same attack, legal attack as before.
How?
Because you have the key to open it, right?
Yeah. Remailers can still be forced to decrypt a message, indeed. So that's the problem, is that you can still, if the message has been intercepted beforehand, so for example, it would not be the case for this Scientology attack, because you would need to have recorded the message entering the mix beforehand. So you need to have that interception in advance. Then you can go and say, decrypt this for me. In the case of Scientology, the leak came out of the mix. If you don't see who sent, yeah.
I'm confused here.
Yeah, okay.
If you're providing a service which allows someone to send an email back to the sender.
Yes.
Okay. So somewhere this information needs to be kept.
Yeah.
Either at the table at the proxy, or encrypted in the message that is being sent and left.
Yes.
Encrypted in there, you need to keep the key to open it when it comes back.
Yes.
Otherwise,
that you're making a very good point, which is anonymous replies are a hard problem. And there are solutions in the latest systems. In Mixed Minion provides a solution for that. But for a long time, it was an open problem, how to securely do anonymous replies. I'll come back. I'll talk about that, yeah. So in this case, if somebody has seen the message going into the mix and has recorded it, they can still go to the mix and say, open this for me. I'm saying mix, although these are not really mixing. It's just really relaying. They were using a PGP encryption. They did not conceal size, so attacks based on size were also possible if you're able to see input and output. And one of the things they did was, instead of having one service, have a chain of remailers. Okay, so instead of going through one, you would go through multiple. Ideally, these are located in different jurisdictions, so that it makes it harder for one single entity to just force, for example, if they have recorded the messages it was sent by Bob here, and they want to sort of de-anonymize the full chain, they would have to be able to force each of these remailers in the middle to decrypt, but maybe they're in different countries. It could be that you have easy access to sort of coerce certain operators in certain countries, but in others might be difficult. So here's actually is somehow strategically playing with diversity of jurisdictions and legal systems in order to, gain some sort of distribution of trust. Yeah.
I missed on the last slide about the fingerprinting.
Yes.
Well, you mentioned that an anonymizer site was doing fingerprinting and then they stopped doing it.
Yes.
But what about the current situation where commercial services are doing fingerprinting? Is there some modern protection?
Okay, yeah. So in the study, okay, I'll talk about that. So in that study found that there are some specific countermeasures for fingerprinting that have been proposed in the form of plugins. They do not really work very well because, yeah, there were ways of still extracting enough information from the browser to identify you. We also check the do not track flag. So if you set do not track flag, does it change anything? Nothing changes, of course. And
send that person extra advertising because he doesn't want it.
Probably, yeah. And so yeah, and the only thing, and then we check Tor. And Tor does offer some protection. We found some vulnerabilities in Tor that were fixed, actually before the paper was released. Still, partial fingerprints can sometimes be extracted from the Tor browser. This is Tor browser, but it was the best protection available, and they are working now. I mean, the goal of Tor, you will be able to see this is a Tor browser, but the goal of Tor is to make it such that this is a Tor browser, through the fingerprint, but you're not able to distinguish between Tor browsers, to make them all uniform. But this is complicated because fonts, for example, are system dependent. So you might have variability there. Yeah. Versions of the browser as well might be distinguishable from each other. But it's a very heavy duty sort of tool to use for protecting against fingerprinting, but yeah, it's the only thing that offers some protection against it. And it must offer it, because when I talk about Tor, I mention fingerprinting attacks, because if you're able to identify clients or distinguish clients based on fingerprints, then all the work that you do, bouncing connections all over the world is sort of defeated. So it must, and it's actually the reason why Tor has a Tor browser, because initially it was relying on Firefox, and it was a plugin, like the Tor button plugin. But the thing is that Firefox was vulnerable to these fingerprinting attacks. And since Firefox was not making it a priority to fix these attacks, Tor sort of branched the Firefox browser, and they made their own browser with additional hardening against these kinds of attacks. And it's still ongoing work. Like they're still trying to plug some of the leakages there. So yeah, that's a bit of a diversion.
All these systems that you're discussing are offline messaging, mail, and such. Are you going to also address instant messaging and like WhatsApp, like
okay.
SMS messages?
No. So some of the ones I mentioned are actually for web browsing primarily, like SafeWeb and Anonymizer. And then there is the Tor, which will come after this, which offers, TCP, anonymous TCP channels, right? So the thing with Tor is that you can also run, some people are running anonymous chat over Tor, and they run it as a hidden server. And then through Tor, you can connect and talk to other people in your chat network anonymously. But then, basically the idea here is that you're offering a layer that is quite neutral of which application you're running on top.
And does it also support it on mobile phones?
No. I believe there is this application called Orbot that is for Android that uses Tor from a mobile phone. But it's only, like iPhone, for example, doesn't have anything. But it's not specific for mobile phones. It's really adapting what is out there for mobile clients. For SMS, for example, I'm not aware of anything. Okay. So replies are a problem. So, okay, this is very nice if you're just sending forward messages, but what if Bob wants Alice to be able to get back to him? Cypherpunk remailers had what is called reusable reply blocks, meaning that you could include, if you wanted an anonymous reply, you could include in your message some sort of blob that Alice could use to send a reply back to you. And these were reusable, and because they were reusable, they were subject to reply attacks. So basically I can, Alice could send one reply back, take some observations, send another reply back, and take some observations. Basically the same receiver has to receive the message every time you send the reply block, so you start intersecting and you find who the anonymous sender is. So that's a problem. So the type 2 anonymous remailer, type 2 cypherpunk remailer is Mixmaster. This is deployed. This is still deployed today, and is the most widely deployed system. It has a few dozen mixes that are still operative. I believe one is in MIT. It's a network of pool mixes and includes some stop-and-go mixes, so these type mixes. It was set up in '95 and has been evolving since then. And since 2008, I believe the code has been stable. It doesn't have many users, but it has a few hundreds or maybe thousands of users. I'm not sure. There are reliable numbers out there. It changed the crypto format to prevent tagging attacks. Tagging attacks are attacks in which you flip one bit in the message, for example, at the entrance, and then you see which message come out corrupted from a certain point on. And then that can help you see that this is the message that you tagged at the input. So what you need to do is that if there is some tagging attack, you need to discard the message altogether. Otherwise, you are opening yourself to tracing. And they said, okay, we cannot really do securely anonymous replies, so no replies. End of story. Okay. And then the more modern generation is what is called mixed minion, so mixed master, then mixed minion, also called type 3 cypherpunk remailer. This is the state of the art. And this, it had to substantially change the design. They use what is called SURBs, single-use reply blocks. Okay, they are single-use to prevent replay attacks. Mixed minion uses 2 sets of headers such that they are further divided into subheaders, and this is such that these headers are swapped, and this is to make replies indistinguishable from forward messages, okay? Because the reply will have sort of like half of the path back encoded, but the other half will be chosen by the person replying, and this makes it hard. So the person replying, you have 16 messages, 16 mixes in the chain. The person replying would choose the first 8, and then there will be a point in which the headers that were sent in the SERP will sort of kick in, and then it will be the next 8 mixes will be the ones chosen by the one who sent you the reply block. It's a rather complicated system. You have to keep lists of seen messages so that you do not route a message twice, and you prevent replay attacks again. And yeah, the goal is to make forward and backward messages indistinguishable, and also protect from tagging. If somebody sort of flips a bit in either a header or the content of the email, the whole thing has to be discarded, because otherwise you can use this corruption in the sort of decryption in order to trace the message. The other issue is the compulsion to decrypt. If you have long-term keys, then anyone recording a message can go to the operator and force them to decrypt. So what mixed minion does is that it has updates keys with one-way functions. So in order to decrypt an old message, you would have to somehow observe the system basically from the beginning of time. Like if you do not observe the system from the beginning of time, then you will be missing, not from the beginning of time, but for a long period of time, you will be missing certain information that is necessary to force decryption, because the old keys have been forgotten. Okay. It's a complicated system. So the next is onion routing, and should I go on for 10 minutes, or we make the break now and start a bit earlier? What do you think? We take 10 minutes now and make the break exactly. Okay, good. Okay, so onion routing, Tor. So onion routing, you might know that it was developed by the Navy Research Lab in the mid-90s. The primary purpose was to protect government communications. Okay, so there are very interesting stories told by Paul Syverson, who's one of the authors of original onion routing design, who said that, okay, you know, in the Navy Research Lab, when they wanted to be anonymous towards the outside world, they had this separate computer that they would use, and then, you know, that was the anonymous computer. And it was somehow having a different IP address from the others, and we were like, okay, but, you know, this is not really working very well, because, you know, it's relatively, I mean, if at some point it's established that this computer with this IP address is from the Navy Research Lab, then everybody will know that whoever is browsing or using it is from the Navy Research Lab. Even if you cannot identify which employee or which person within the organization is using it, you still know that is the organization. Okay? So if you want to be really anonymous and, you know, go through the internet without nobody knowing that you are from the government, then you need to mix with civilians. Otherwise, you know, you are a government agent. Otherwise. So that's the original onion routing, and it's, they had, I believe, a test network running already in the 90s. There was a commercial system implemented by Zero Knowledge Systems, a Canadian company. It was called the Freedom Network, and operated between, I think, 1999 and 2001. And it actually stopped operations, I believe, in October 2001. The interesting thing, and I know some of the people who were involved in the Freedom Network, was that they had, because it was a paid service, and they were not really getting customers to, you know, enough money to, it was not a viable service, right? So they were planning to stop the service, and the date they had planned to stop the service was September 11, 2001. Okay. So obviously, when the attacks happened, they decided not to stop the service because it would look like, it was a direct link to the events. So they kept it operating a bit longer, and then they stopped. But I mean, coincidences are sometimes amazing. So second generation onion routing is the Tor network. Has been operating since 2003, and I will give you some numbers now. So Tor provides bidirectional low latency communication channels, so not messages, isolated, same size, no, connections, like a pipe that you can use for any interactive application. It does not perform any mixing, so Tor routers are not mixes. They do not delay messages on purpose, they do not shuffle messages, none of that is happening. It's just, they are just relaying, okay? They do not add padding, and they do not do traffic shaping in the sense of, trying to modify the shape of the traffic, nothing. They just forward packets, okay? So they are proxies, relays. Connection-based instead of message-based, and they can be used for all kinds of applications. The killer application for Tor is web browsing. So a big part of the traffic is web browsing, although some people use it also for BitTorrent, running over Tor, particularly for avoiding censorship. And I mean, you can also use it for instant messaging, for secure shell, and there are a number of hidden services that are available in Tor, and that provide you with different applications. Some numbers. This is the number of nodes in Tor since 2008, when they started with start making metrics. So you can see that the number has been steadily increasing, and right now it's about 6,000 volunteer nodes, which is a pretty big number, I should say. That's the red curve, and it seems to be like scaling nicely and increasing nicely. The blue line is what is called bridges. Bridges are not really Tor relays. Bridges are sort of secret entry points to the Tor network that people who live in places in which Tor is blocked, censored, they can, instead of, you can block Tor very easily because the list of relays is public. There's a directory saying these are the Tor nodes, these are their keys, these are their IP addresses, that you can just block all those IP addresses and you have blocked Tor in your jurisdiction or in your ISP or whatever. So ways to offer the possibility to access Tor to people who live in places where Tor is blocked, which are often people who really need Tor, because if Tor is blocked, probably many other things are blocked too, are using what is called bridges. So bridges are client computers. So for example, I can run a bridge in this computer. I have a Tor client. I set the bridge flag on. This means that Tor will use my contact details and distribute them in different ways to people in places where Tor is censored, so that those people can access my computer, because my IP address and my contact details are not listed publicly in the Tor directory. It is much more difficult to block me as being a Tor bridge. And the number of bridges is currently around 4,000. How to distribute this to?
Could you also have, if somebody is willing to be a public Tor bridge, but he has also different users, basically saying if you block Tor, you're blocking me as well, and then it will make the internet less useful. Like, I mean, if Facebook would do that.
Yes, very good question. So actually, there is lots of recent work on that, very exciting work. So people are proposing exactly that kind of systems. So there was actually one paper in PES this year that proposed such a system using cloud services, so systems like services like Amazon services. And if you can run a service in Amazon that is not obvious that this is somehow an entry to the Tor network, you would have to block lots of very useful services that most countries don't want to block. It's an all or nothing approach. Either you block everything to block Tor, or if you don't block everything, then you are letting people connect through there to the Tor network.
That's all the news sites, if you can tell them you support privacy.
Well, news sites are censored in many places, actually. Yeah. Facebook is censored in many places as well. So these are, I think, cloud services are, because they are commercially very valuable. I think big countries like China, for example, are, I think, reluctant to block them. There are also what is called flash proxies, which are also using websites like ephemerally to act as Tor bridges. So There's very, partially because there is very intensive censorship efforts going on. Particularly China is very sophisticated in censoring Tor. I believe Iran also censors Tor. Well, a bunch of countries, but China and Iran seem to be the more sophisticated ones in doing so, especially China. And there is really an arms race in the sense that they find ways to block Tor, and then Tor finds out how they are blocking it. I mean, some of the blocking is based on identifying sort of the handshake in the protocol and trying to see that this is not a normal, connection, but a Tor connection, or trying to connect to the client you're talking to, and trying to speak Tor to that client and see if the client responds, and then it's a Tor bridge. So they are actually engaging in all of that. And of course, that makes it interesting, and that makes researchers look for solutions to that. Other proposals engage ISPs. So basically, you would encode somehow some cryptographic material in random-looking fields that, when captured by a big ISP, and I mean, if you get AT&T on board or like one of the big ISPs, they somehow can. If you don't have the secrets, looks like this is like random nonce. If you know the secret, this is a Tor connection, and you can use that to, connect it to the Tor network. So yeah, very, very active and exciting work in the counter-censorship, like censorship circumvention. Okay, so number of users in Tor, somewhere between 1 and 2 million at the moment per day. That's a nice number. It's actually, I would say, is one of the privacy technologies with largest user base. I don't think we have achieved such numbers in any other applications. Partially is because Tor has made massive efforts to make it very easy to use. Basically, you download the thing, install, and it works, and you don't need to have any expertise as a user in order to make it work. So no, fancy configuration, things to do, nothing like that. Actually, in the NSA slides, when they were talking about Tor, they were saying something like, users make a mistake, and it was like, this is very hard because it's sort of dumb-proof, right, Tor. So usability has definitely been a key success factor here. It can be slow sometimes because the network is congested. So you see here this peak, right? Sure, everybody's looking at that. This was a bot. So it was interesting because it happened shortly after the NSA revelations, and it was like, wow, so many people are coming into Tor, this is great, after the Snowden thing. And then it turns out that it was a bot. So the bots started using Tor for their command and control communications. And then, they stayed there for a while. It seems they're abandoning it now. Fortunately, they didn't completely congest the network because they were only using it for control messages and not for like anything else. I think it's suspected that the command and control was run as a hidden server. And they were not sending, so because it was run as a hidden server, they were not really sending, massive messages outside the network using exit nodes, just, hidden servers. So it didn't completely disrupt Tor. Tor was also reluctant to take action against the bots, because what if you take action and then the bot guys get really pissed off and then they can really come after you. And if they have that kind of number of computers, they can very easily put Tor out of service rather quickly. So it was just like, okay, don't do anything. And it seems that they have moved on to something else, but it's unclear. I mean, the real number of users should be somewhere between 1 and 2 million.
Can we ask the botnet operators to actually use the net as exit nodes or relay nodes?
Yeah. That was discussed. Like, yeah, it would be nice if they run like exit nodes as well. Although I'm not sure you want to have like one entity with so many exit points. That might be a problem too. Huh? And then one of the things, especially people who have been in the business for a long time, and they say, "Oh, but Tor is so slow. I tried it 5 years ago and I never used it again." Okay, well, it has been improving in terms of performance. It's still slow. So this is the time it takes to download a 50 kilobyte request, and you can see that even in 2010, 2011, the latencies could be quite high. In the last let's say, couple of years, the performance is actually quite reasonable. So when I use it, I mean, you notice a delay, but it's not that you try to download the page, go make a coffee, come back, and still, that's no longer the case. Okay, so I think I'll leave it at this, and then continue after the break. Okay, thank you.